Nearly $1.5 billion in additional aid to Ukraine hints that the US may lift its objection to Ukraine striking well inside Russian territory and renewed sanctions amid the accusation that Iran is providing missiles to Russia. Now, those are the main headlines as the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy pledged additional support to Kyiv. The aid is aimed largely at bolstering Ukraine's energy grid that Russia has, of course, repeatedly pounded ahead of a very expected difficult winter there ahead. It remains, though, that question of Ukraine being allowed to strike inside Russian territory that still is difficult to overcome.
I'm going to take that discussion back to Washington to brief the president on what I heard. I know that David's doing the same. And both of our bosses, no doubt, will discuss this when they meet later this week. From day one, as you've heard me say, we have adjusted and adapted as needs have changed, as the battlefield has changed, and I have no doubt that we'll continue to do that as this evolves.
Antony Blinken there. Well, our international affairs commentator Doug Herbert is with us here on set. Doug, it sounds there that Ukraine has not quite got what it wants from the US, but it might be close.
Yeah, it might be close. Listen. We heard slightly wooded language there, right, from Antony Blinken, Secretary of State. Adjusted and adapted policy. Look, throughout this war, we have seen the U.S. and the Western lines of what they are willing to provide to Ukraine shift incrementally throughout the war, ultimately meeting Ukraine's demands. We see a similar pattern here. And yes, you're right. You can't rule out the possibility that they'll keep the ban in place, but it looks like Blinken and his counterpart, David Lammy, they're each going to go back to their bosses, Joe Biden, Keir Starmer, who's meeting with Joe Biden in Washington on Friday, and they're basically going to lay down the lines, the new information given to them by the Ukrainians. Look, the situation as of now is the Ukrainian arsenal has a lot of these Western-supplied long-range missiles. We're talking about three major suppliers, right? The U.S. giving these so-called ATACMS, which have a range of about 300 kilometers. You have France with its Scalp missiles, which is about 250 kilometers, a little less. And you have the U.K. with its Storm Shadow missiles, same range as the French runs, about 250. It's significant, the ranges, because it would give Ukraine what it says is an absolutely necessary ability to strike what it says are legitimate military targets. This is air bases, airfields, from which Ukraine says Russia is launching a lot of these missiles that are devastating, that are raining havoc across Ukraine. You mentioned the energy grid. On that and other civilian infrastructure, it desperately wants to be able to not have its hands tied behind its back. As of now, Ukraine is only able to use those missiles that I mentioned, the Scalps and the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows, for short-range attacks on the border areas, notably around Kharkiv, where there had been a big Russian and a lot of fighting a few months back, and in the Belgorod region area, also right across from Kharkiv. It wants to extend that range. The U.S. has said until now, and this is important, Stuart, the U.S. has said in not lifting the ban that it wouldn't make a difference if they did, because Russia's already moved assets, air assets, from about 16 airfields in Russia further back to rear areas out of range of those missiles. And Ukraine has too few of its ATACMS anyway to make a difference. The Institute for the Study of War says, trying to sort of fight back on that argument, saying it would make a difference, because beyond those air bases, Russia has not moved assets, or at least there's no sign of, from at least maybe over 200 other military and paramilitary airfields and other sites that could be legitimate targets for Ukraine that would make a difference in this war. So they say that the U.S. argument is becoming thinner and thinner for not lifting that ban. The U.S. has one possible justification. Antony Blinken alluded to this, the fact that it claims Iran has been delivering these new long-range ballistic missiles to Russia, which also are making the fight for Ukraine a lot harder. That could offer the U.S. an opt-out, a justification for lifting the ban.
How crucial is all this, Doug? I mean, Volodymyr Zelensky certainly seems to recognise that it is vital for the survival of Ukraine.
Yeah, he has said explicitly the U.S. has been Ukraine's key military backer. Yes, there were several months, a few months back, you'll remember, when Republicans in Congress, at the behest of Donald Trump, were holding up, curtailing that military aid, perhaps presenting a big setback to Ukraine on the battlefield, which it's yet to really make up for, even though those arms are trickling in again. But Zelensky has said it in recent days. He says that sort of Ukraine's ultimate situation and destiny in this war depends in large part, essentially, on the United States and its position. This is also one of the cases why Ukrainian officials are not just pleading to lift that Western ban, but they're pleading, for the election, obviously for an outcome that they think will be in their favor. But its foreign minister is asking NATO allies along the border with Ukraine, where Russian missiles have been hitting in western parts of Ukraine, to start to fire missiles from their own territory, that is NATO territory, not from Russian territory, to shoot down those missiles in western Ukraine because they are jeopardizing NATO. So there's a lot going on here where the Ukraine is basically pleading with the West. This is in your interest. It's your dire interest. Your borders are being threatened. And in the U.S. case, it's your own national interest, which is ultimately affected by the destiny of Ukraine, Europe, and the U.S.
Doug, our viewers might just have noticed we've had a debate this week between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. 2 months to go until this election, under 2 months now. Of course, everybody in Ukraine watching that election very closely, because that is going to be pivotal, isn't it?
Millions were watching Ukraine, reportedly. The public broadcaster there carried this debate because, as you said, this debate has existential ramifications for a lot of Ukrainians. Donald Trump was directly asked during the debate, does he want Ukraine to win? Does his policy in support of Ukraine winning this war? He gave something like a 400-word response. It was a yes or no question, essentially, yes or no. He didn't answer the question. He gave a 400-word response where he simply says, I want the war stopped, which alludes to Donald Trump has sort of bragged, that's the word I'll use, throughout that he, unlike anyone else, would be able to end this war within 24 hours. And he even said that in the debate itself, he said, this war would be over if I'm elected before I actually take the office, because I would already be on the phones with Ukraine, with Russia, to get this war over. What that means when Ukraine hears Donald Trump saying this during the debate, it means that Donald Trump would favor Ukraine's capitulation, because ending the war tomorrow would essentially mean ending the war on Vladimir Putin's terms. Those terms are keeping all the territory he seized and basically dismembering Ukraine as a sovereign state, at least as it existed before February 2022. So that's a no-go for Ukraine for obvious reasons. Donald Trump's arguments that he wants the war stopped are essentially a signal to Ukraine. When Ukraine hears that, it hears, no, we don't necessarily want Ukraine to win this war. We just want the war to end. And if that means that Russia ends up with all the territory it's captured, so be it. At least I've ended the war. Donald Trump didn't explicitly say it that way, but that's how Ukrainians hear it. And that is really how Donald Trump has implicitly suggested he would push his Ukraine policy. Let's remember, he was one of the biggest ralliers of his Republican Party to curtail that military aid I was speaking to that was frozen for many months in Congress. There is bipartisan support, Republicans and Democrats, voters in America, for continued military aid to Ukraine. If Donald Trump is elected, the plug on that continued support may be pulled.